Well, I guess he has to be one of the natives of this area since he grew up over in East Sioux Falls in part, and then leaving the plains went into the Marines. Following his stint in the Marines, he tells me that he played in a rock band for a day or two out in the West Coast, and eventually then, as that tapered off, I guess in the late 60s, got his undergraduate degree out in California and also got his law degree in California, practiced law in the West Coast for a number of years, and then eventually came back here. But it's interesting because beyond his legal profession, Wayne really has been a very prodigious author. I think he wrote about 12 books, 13 books, 50, 11, you're working on 12 right now. Certainly presented a lot of papers at conferences, and it's a face that everybody knows from the Dakota History Conference. But in any case, the piece this evening that he'll be speaking on, I ran over and grabbed a copy of it. Well, didn't run over and grab a copy, I could hardly find one, but got a hold of one, and now I see I can purchase one. And I would suggest that you might want to purchase one of these because it's a very interesting read. It takes us into the good, the bad, and the ugly of the frontier characters that wandered around the northern plains here, particularly up here in the Dakotas. So I think you'll find this to be a really interesting presentation, and so thank you.
Well, thank you, Adrian, for the introduction. Yes, I'm going to be talking about my book, Tales of Dakota Territory. But before I get into the individual tales, I wanted to mention that years ago when I had a law practice in San Diego, and I was working day and night on what became my biography of Senator Pettigrew, that was in November. During the course of the research, I kept coming over all these interesting little articles and stories about frontier characters that seemed entirely lost to history. So I started saving these, and I come up with the idea of Tales of Dakota Territory, just these little vignettes here. Volume 1 is out of print, and I do have some Volume 2, which I think were more interesting than the ones in Volume 1. But I think it's interesting that you'd have an old fossil like me talking to a bunch of archaeologists. And I must warn you, sometimes my senior moments last 5 minutes or more, but I'll work on that too. So anyway, I want to start talking about one of the tales. This one is about the assassination of Secretary McCook. Now, you may wonder who Secretary McCook is, but he was, but what's interesting to me is when an ordinary person was killed, they were just simply shot or murdered. But when a person of importance, of stature, was killed, it was an assassination. So, how did McCook become the Secretary of Dakota Territory, and how did he gain his fame? Well, he was a Civil War veteran. He was a brigadier general who served under General Grant in the Civil War, and he was a part of what became known as the Fighting McCooks of Ohio. And the extended family, 3 branches of that family, had 17 men who served for the Union Army during the Civil War. Some were doctors, one was a chaplain, others were infantrymen, cavalrymen, and 3 or 4 of them attained the rank of general. General McCook, as I said, served under Grant, and when the war was over, it was time for these veterans to go around and look for jobs in the government. Now, Grant offered McCook Secretary of the Territory of Dakota. So he went out here in 1873, and he felt like a celebrity because he was fighting McCook. And he gathered people who liked him, people who didn't like him, but he stepped into a political mess because in the early 1870s, the Republican Party of Dakota Territory was at war with each other. In Yankton, the capital, there was what they called the Capitol Street Gang and the Broadway Street Gang. And they both fought for control of the offices of Yankton and Dakota Territory. Now, okay, so who killed General McCook? How was he assassinated? Well, he was shot by a rival Republican who was part of the Broadway Street Gang, and McCook sided in with the governor of the territory. He was part of the Capitol Street Gang. So at a meeting one night in Yankton, Peter Wintermute was the man who had shot McCook. Now he was kind of an obscure individual, but he made money. He was from upstate New York. He went west to Minnesota and Wisconsin, was involved in railroad building, and he came to Dakota Territory and set up a bank, one of the first banks in Yankton. And one night, there was a meeting at the territorial capital, of what they called a railroads meeting, because they were talking about funds for building the railroad into Dakota Territory in Yankton. And both McCook and Wintermute went down to the bar in the basement and started arguing. And Wintermute, who was a real small guy, McCook was a great big guy, Wintermute threatened to whip McCook, which he couldn't do, obviously. But they came to blows in the bar, and McCook, punched Wintermute a couple times, and they left. He left the bar. They all went back to the railroad meeting. One of the speakers was talking in favor of the railroad or something, and all of a sudden, here comes Wintermute, all beaten up, and he announced to the crowd, "General Cook beat me up, and look what happened to me." So, by this time, McCook was back, so Wintermute took out his pistol and shot McCook point blank in front of all those gathered at the meeting. McCook died, and Wintermute was held and charged with murder, as you might expect. Now, there was a trial in Yankton, and Wintermute was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. But of course, Wintermute had a lot of money, so his attorneys appealed the conviction. And it was a second trial in Vermilion, which was much more favorable politically to Wintermute. So the next jury come up with an out acquittal. And the whole territory was in an uproar over this. How could somebody shoot someone else point blank range in a whole crowd of people and get away with it? But Wintermute really didn't get away with it because the stress and strain of the trials and all that had a real terrible effect on him, and he went back to New York City and died. McCook was given this grand funeral. His body was taken back to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he had this great heroic funeral and so forth. And he joined he had 3 brothers and a father who were killed in the Civil War. So he was seen more, he wasn't a victim of the war, but he was a victim of the aftermath of the war. So that is another one tale. The other tale I'm going to talk about is what I call the bad man from rural county. Now, there were outlaws, quite a few outlaws in Dakota Territory, but they weren't anything like what you see on TV or the movies. First of all, they were not well armed. They were lucky to have some beat-up old pistol that would sometimes misfire. But they weren't these gunfights. In fact, all the research I did for every book I've ever done, I only come up with one instance where there was a stand-up gunfight, and that was in Fort Pierre. That was the only one. Most of the shootings took place in saloons where men were gambling, they got drunk, and were upset over, who won the poker game. But there was this guy, Jim Summers, who was a bad man from Dakota Territory. He came from Canada, came to Dakota in 1859, settled in what is now Union County, and eventually he worked his way up to Yankton, where he became the sergeant-at-arms at the first territorial legislature. Dakota Territory was created in March of 1861, so they had the first legislature in that year. Jim Summers was the sergeant-at-arms. Now, these kind of lawmaking meetings were nothing like you see today, because some of the quote-unquote representatives come in with their guns, their knives, their whiskey bottles, and try to encourage people to pass laws in accordance with their wishes. But Summers became a part of a plot to push through some legislation. But before they had to do that, they had to get rid of the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So the plot was that Summers, being the sergeant-at-arms, would take a hold of the Speaker and throw him out of the chambers. And then the chair would be vacant, and they'd be free to select a new Speaker. That wasn't obviously not the legal way to do it, but technically that was true. The chair would be vacant because the Speaker would be out in the street. So that didn't work, but after that session was over, Big Jim Summers, they all retired to a saloon. They grabbed the Speaker and threw him through the window of the saloon out in the street. So, that's primitive lawmaking, but that's how they did it in those days. But Summers was this, he was just kind of an incorrigible character, and he was really especially dangerous when he got drunk. And nobody could beat him up in a fight. Sometimes they would brag about beating up Jim Summers, but always when Jim Summers wasn't around. So Summers went upriver along the Missouri and set up a roadhouse, which is they were called a ranch in those days, but they were just rough roadhouses where people could go and drink and get their head busted. And then he came back to Yankton once, and he was in the mood to have some fun. He was drunk, he shot a horse, and he shot and wounded the sheriff. But then he got away and went up to the upriver country where nobody could find him. But now the guy, the sheriff, this guy George Wilson, was an interesting character. In the late 1860s, he and a friend were out in the western part of South Dakota, and they killed somebody. Illinois, he went back to Illinois, and somehow they found out that he shot this guy way out in the west, and all of a sudden somebody said, well, hey, that's Dakota Territory. We can't try him here. So they had the marshal come to Chicago, take him back to Yankton. They were tried for murder, and they were acquitted. The convictions were very hard to get in the territorial days. So they were acquitted, and this guy, George Wilson, decided he's going to run for sheriff of the county where he had just been tried for murder, and he was elected. So he had his competition with Jim Summers. Now, after Summers shot the sheriff and the pony, he headed out to the upper Missouri region, and he actually just started his little respectable life when rural county was formed. He was a county commissioner. His brother came and his nephew came to live there, and they got into a quarrel once, and over some wood, because one of the ways men made their living along the Missouri River was to cut wood for the steamboats that came through. And Jim Summers and his nephew, Bradley, got into an argument over a pile of wood. They shot each other, and they killed each other right then and there. So that's the end. That's the sad end to Jim Summers. Now the third, I'm going to try to find it here, tale, which I find pretty interesting, was okay. This is a tale that I call Dime Novels Made Him Do It. Now, dime novels were a popular form of like pulp fiction in the mid-19th century. And they were just made-up stories about Western characters, outlaws, lawmen, doing all these heroic things in the West. But they were directed to, you only paid a dime for them. The kids would read these things, and they had a negative influence on a lot of kids. And this one kid, whose name was James Gilmore. He was from a prominent Ohio family, and he had a steady diet of these dime novels. So he says, I'm going to go out west and live like these fictional heroes lived. So he went to California, and then he worked his way back, and he ended up in Dakota Territory. And he got a job as a driver of a wagon train from Fort Pierre to Deadwood. And he was from a prominent family, but he was a wild kid. He was uncontrollable. He had a bad temper. And then, of course, that, along with the dime novels, made him dangerous. He had a good family in Ohio. He had a brother that was a lawyer. He had another brother who was a naval officer. But Jim Gilmore was slated for a tragic life. So he gets a job as a bullwhacker, what they call him. And one night, after they were in camp, he got into an argument with another driver, a Mexican by the name of Ortiz. And Jim Gilmore lost his temper, and after an argument, he pulled his pistol and shot and killed this guy Ortiz. And he gets on his horse and he absconds. He heads for the upper Missouri River country. He ends up down by Yankton, and he became essentially an outlaw. He was known as one of the hog ranch he finally gets recaptured, and because he couldn't keep his mouth shut, for one thing. And he said, "What? You're arresting me killing that Mexican? That was an accident." Well, it didn't work out that way, so he was taken back to Rapid City, where he was tried for murder before Judge Gideon C. Moody. Now, Moody himself came from the frontier too. He had been in Dakota since 1864, and he knew his way around. He was a prominent political figure. He was a friend of R.F. Pettigrew, and they were both destined to be the first U.S. senators when South Dakota was admitted to the Union of States. But right now, he's presiding over the murder trial of this kid, James Gilmore. And the jury found him guilty, and Moody sentenced him to hang. And once his family found out that he was out in Dakota Territory and all this trouble, I mean, they made every effort. They sent people out to try to, persuade him that this guy wasn't in his right mind. He can't be responsible for what he was doing. And then also, interesting, because Gilmore was a good-looking kid and all that stuff, the women of Deadwood took care, they kind of took him under their wing, so to speak. They brought him food, clothing, and all the stuff. But when it looked like that, that he was not going to get a new trial, and an appeal to the President of the United States, Chester Arthur, went for naught. That eventually he was going to be executed, and he was this was in 1882, and he was buried in Montmoriah Cemetery. Interesting that his family didn't want to ship his body back to Ohio. So anyway, that's kind of a sampling of what you would read in this tale of Dakota Territory, because there was just an unending amount of really interesting characters that roamed the Dakota Territory. And I want to thank you all for listening. If you have any questions or anything